Shin Godzilla doesn't hunt. It doesn't have to. It is, quite literally, an evolving nuclear weapon with a face. And in Hideaki Anno's 2016 reimagining, this thing mutates through 4 distinct forms in under 48 hours. It crawls out of Tokyo Bay as an eyeless aquatic fish thing, learns to walk in less than a day, sprouts arms, and then balloons into a 118-meter atomic apex predator that fires energy beams not just from its mouth, from its tail, its dorsal fins, anywhere it wants. For scale, that's taller than the Statue of Liberty stacked on top of Big Ben, walking through downtown Tokyo, glowing. And right when you think the film has shown you the worst it has, the camera pans up to the frozen tail. Already mid-mitosis, already budding, dozens of humanoid copies, tiny Shin Godzillas, cloning themselves into existence on a corpse that isn't even dead yet. But here's the question I cannot let go of. What if this thing wasn't just nightmare fuel? What if a real organism, built from real chemistry, real cells, real evolutionary pressure, could pull off something even remotely like this? Not by magic, not by movie logic, by actual biology. This is Evolved Codex, the series where I take iconic creatures from movies, games, and myths, and reimagine them through the lens of real-world evolution. Today, the patient on the dissection table is Shin Godzilla, a kaiju so structurally impossible that even untangling one of its organ systems forces us to invent biology we've never observed. We're going to do it anyway. To answer whether something like Shin Godzilla could exist, I'm scoring it across 4 categories: habitat adaptability, dietary compatibility, competition and predation, reproductive success, each 1 out of 10. Against what real Earth biology will actually allow. And stick around to the end because after the final verdict, I'll walk you through 3 ways Shin Godzilla might evolve over the next few thousand years. To either integrate into Earth's ecosystem, or completely erase it. Let's decode the impossible. Let's start with habitat, because in the film, this creature emerges from Tokyo Bay before it can even properly stand. And that single fact tells me 2 things. 1, the originating environment is aquatic. 2, whatever food web is supporting an organism this strange, it looks nothing like any marine ecosystem we know. In the film's canon, the creature's evolution is triggered by exposure to radioactive waste dumped in the deep Pacific. So the closest real analog we have on Earth is Lake Karachay in Russia. Historically, the most radioactive natural body of water on the planet. At its peak, it held around 4.4 exabecquerels of radioactivity. Standing on its shore for 1 hour delivered a fatal dose. That's a body of water that kills you faster than holding your breath underwater would. And yet, even there, life finds a way. Studies of Karachay's sediments have isolated extremophile bacteria, relatives of Deinococcus radiodurans, that thrive in conditions that would unravel a human cell in minutes. So the initial habitat for a Shin Godzilla-like organism wouldn't be a normal Pacific trench. It would need to be a radiation-enriched abyssal vent system. Picture this: a hydrothermal field where uranium-bearing minerals, pitchblende, auchinite, carnotite, are upwelling alongside hot reduced gases. The water there is hot, dark, mineralized, mildly radioactive. And this is not science fiction. The Loihi Seamount off Hawaii, the Lost City hydrothermal field, the Galapagos Rift, all of them host bacterial communities surviving on chemosynthesis at temperatures pushing 113 degrees Celsius. That's hotter than the boiling point of water. Hot enough to flash cook a steak in seconds, and bacteria call it home. Give those vent communities a million-year head start with a uranium-fueled substrate, and you have the raw conditions for something that handles radioactivity like a feature, not a bug. But here's where things get tricky. Shin Godzilla doesn't stay in the deep ocean. By Form 2, it's coming ashore. By Forms 3 and 4, it's fully terrestrial, and arguably urban. That is a habitat range no single Earth organism has ever pulled off. The closest real-world examples we have for an extreme ocean-to-land transition: eels making spawning runs into freshwater, and tetrapod ancestors like Tiktaalik that crawled out of Devonian shallows about 375 million years ago. Those transitions took tens of millions of years. Shin Godzilla does it in under 2 days. So the ocean phase is plausible. The terrestrial transition? It demands a mutation rate orders of magnitude beyond anything we know in nature. Cancer cells can mutate at roughly 10,000 times the normal somatic rate. To do what Shin Godzilla does, you'd need at least another 2 orders of magnitude on top of that. Targeted, non-lethal, directed. Earth biology simply doesn't operate at that speed without falling apart. And then there's the urban environment. Tokyo is not a habitat. It's a hostile concrete grid. No water column for cooling, no prey base, which we'll come back to, no migratory corridors, just hot pavement, glass, and 20 million terrified humans. Combine ocean vent origins, brief terrestrial walks, and a stationary urban posture, and you get a creature that is technically habitat flexible, but profoundly limited to a tiny set of compatible Earth environments. So I'm scoring Shin Godzilla a habitat adaptability rating of 6 out of 10. Strong in extremes, brittle in the middle. From a dietary perspective alone, Shin Godzilla breaks every textbook I own. Let me explain. In Anno's film, we never once see this creature eat. No prey, no swallowed objects, no digestive sequences, and yet it grows by tens of meters in body length over a span of hours. That kind of mass accumulation, in any conventional biological framework, demands enormous caloric input. A blue whale, the largest mammal on Earth, eats around 4 tons of krill per day to maintain its 180-ton body. Shin Godzilla, in its final form, is estimated at over 50,000 tons. By any standard scaling law, this thing should be devouring entire ecosystems daily. Whole pods of whales, forests, cities. It doesn't. So the only way this works biologically is if Shin Godzilla is running an entirely different energy economy from the rest of the tree of life. Not chemosynthesis, not photosynthesis, not predation. Something stranger. Here's where Anno's design actually starts to make a twisted kind of sense. The creature's biology is built around what fans and biologists have started calling a bone-fission core. The idea is Shin Godzilla's skeleton, particularly the dense calcium-uranium plating in its spinal column and skull, functions as a controlled nuclear fission lattice. Don't think of its bones as structural support. Think of them as a slow-burn reactor, a walking, breathing power plant with a face. And this is not as ridiculous as it sounds. Real Earth biology already interacts with radioactive elements at the molecular level. Deinococcus radiodurans, sometimes called Conan the bacterium, can survive 5,000 grays of ionizing radiation, a dose that would kill a human 1,000 times over. It does this by maintaining multiple genome copies and an absurdly efficient DNA repair toolkit. Geobacter metal reducens, a bacterium found in groundwater near uranium-contaminated sites, actively breathes uranium ions, the way you and I breathe oxygen. It reduces soluble uranium-6 to insoluble uranium-4 as part of its metabolism. And then there's a famous class of radiotrophic fungi growing inside the Chernobyl sarcophagus right now. They appear to use the melanin in their cell walls to convert gamma radiation into usable metabolic energy. Fungi, eating radiation, for breakfast. Give evolution enough time and enough radioactive substrate, and what you get is an organism that doesn't merely tolerate radiation, it eats it. And once you accept that, the rest of Shin Godzilla's biology starts to assemble. Here's how the fuel cycle would actually work. Embedded in the marrow of Shin Godzilla's largest bones, pelvis, femur, vertebral column, small chambers of uranium-235 or thorium-232, organically structured, lined with a melanin-rich tissue that functions as a biological neutron moderator. Same principle as graphite in a reactor. Surrounding the fuel chambers, bone plates loaded with biological magnetite, acting with absurd precision as living control rods. Twitch those plates closer to the fuel fission speeds up. Pull them away, it slows down. The creature is throttling its own nuclear core with muscle. And then there's the circulation. Shin Godzilla doesn't have blood the way we think of it. Its circulatory system would carry a high-temperature, heavy water analog, pulling heat from the fission core out to muscle tissue, where the heat drives mitochondrial-like organelles at extraordinary output. The waste heat that doesn't get used? It exits through the dorsal fin slits, those famous glowing plates that light up before the creature fires. Those plates are not decoration, they're the radiator. They're also, when Shin Godzilla decides to weaponize them, the ignition system. The atomic beam itself would be superheated plasma, exhausted under enormous pressure through specialized vents in the throat, dorsal ridge, and tail tip. And before you tell me that's impossible, real biology already produces directed projectile chemistry. The bombardier beetle fires a 100 degrees Celsius chemical spray from a posterior gland. Electric eels generate 600 volts, enough to stun a horse. Archerfish spit precision water jets accurate to within centimeters at 2-meter ranges. Shin Godzilla just turns the volume up by about 10,000. So, what does this organism actually need to eat? Almost nothing, in the traditional sense. A steady fuel replenishment, periodic ingestion of uranium or thorium ores, possibly from coastal deposits or radioactive waste sites. Heavy water for its circulatory fluid, trace elements for tissue repair. And the film shows Shin Godzilla freezing in place for hours at a time, completely motionless. That isn't catatonia. That's a creature running its reactor at idle. Healing tissue, replenishing isotopes from absorbed dust and groundwater. Shin Godzilla is not a predator. It is a slow-burn, living power plant that happens to wear flesh. From an Earth biology standpoint, this level of energetic self-sufficiency is wildly beyond anything we've documented. But the chemical pieces all exist, scattered across different lineages. To pull them together into one organism would require what evolutionary biologists call a convergent jackpot. A single-line ancestrally inheriting radiotrophic metabolism, calcium-binding actinide pathways, magnetite-based control of nuclear physics, and high-temperature plasma exhaust. It is, frankly, almost impossible. Almost. So I'm scoring Shin Godzilla a dietary compatibility rating of 8 out of 10. Not because the diet is plausible across the average ecosystem, but because the diet pathway radiotrophic energy capture is genuinely supported by living organisms today, scaled up wildly, but supported. And now, things get genuinely terrifying. Let's stack Shin Godzilla against the modern world's apex predators. The largest carnivore on land today is the polar bear, around 700 kilograms. The largest in the ocean is the orca, about 6,000. The largest known predator that ever lived, the megalodon shark Otodus megalodon, clocked in at roughly 50,000 kilograms, with a bite force of 180,000 newtons. Shin Godzilla, in Form 4, weighs around 50,000 tons. That is 1,000 times heavier than a megalodon. The size disparity here isn't in the same league as anything in Earth's known biological history. It's closer to the scale of small sauropod swarms, except wrapped into a single nervous system. Now, you might counter, and reasonably, that humans have invented weapons that can deal with creatures this physically large. We have bombs, missiles, railguns, and in the film, the Japanese Self-Defense Force coordinates with the US military. They drop bunker busters, fire massive bus-sized rounds, finally execute the so-called Yashiori strategy. They throw everything at this thing, and it just adapts. So what does Shin Godzilla actually have, biologically, that handles military-grade ordnance? 3 things. First, armor. Shin Godzilla's outer dermal layer is implied to be a ceramic silicate composite, possibly biomineralized from absorbed silica and aluminum during its terrestrial transition. Real Earth biology has built equivalent structures at smaller scales. Pangolins grow keratin scales hard enough to deflect lion bites and even small caliber rifle rounds in some documented cases. Alligator gar grow ganoid scales, calcium phosphate plates, layered over each other like biological chainmail. And the extinct glyptodonts of Pleistocene South America walked around inside 2-ton osteoderm shells that would have shrugged off saber-tooth predation. Multiply pangolin scale architecture across a 118-meter frame. Swap in radiation-shielded ceramic plating, and you have a creature whose skin essentially functions as inch-thick battlefield armor. Second, regeneration. The film explicitly shows Shin Godzilla rebuilding damaged tissue in real time. Wounds close, bones reknit. Radiation burns flush new dermal layers within hours. This is not foreign to Earth biology either. Axolotls can regenerate entire limbs, including bone, nerve, and vascular structures, in a few weeks. Planarian flatworms can be sliced into hundreds of fragments, and each piece grows back into a complete worm. Hydra can be put through a blender, and they reform from a few thousand surviving cells. The genetic machinery for limb-scale regeneration absolutely exists in our planet's biota. Shin Godzilla just runs it at industrial cadence, powered by a continuous fission supply. Third, and this is the part that makes this creature genuinely unkillable by conventional means, mutation under stress. In the film, every time the JSDF, or US Air Force, inflicts damage, Shin Godzilla evolves a specific countermeasure. Bombs hit, it grows new beam emitters. Tanks fire, it coats itself in heavier plating. Aircraft strafe, it develops omnidirectional plasma rays from its dorsal fins. This is an organism that treats damage not as injury, but as feedback. As a free trial run for the next iteration of its body plan. And Real Earth biology has a quiet version of this. It's called stress-induced mutagenesis. Haemophilus influenzae, when starved, will dial up its mutation rate by orders of magnitude in a targeted attempt to find a survivable phenotype. Bacterial biofilms under antibiotic pressure routinely accumulate mutations at rates 100 times the baseline. Cancer cells under chemotherapy, stress can throw out hypermutation events that produce resistance within weeks. The mechanism is real. Shin Godzilla just lives it at the whole organism scale, every single hour. What that means for any competition tier on Earth, including the entire combined military capability of the human species, is bleak. There is no other organism in Earth's history that could realistically compete with Shin Godzilla in a head-to-head fight. Mosasaurs, megalodons, T-Rex, dragons of every fictional franchise. They all lose. The only thing that can damage Shin Godzilla long-term is denying it fuel input, which is exactly what the Yashiori strategy does in the film. They pour blood, coagulants, and refrigerant analogs down its throat to freeze its internal reactor, locking it in place. And even that doesn't kill it, it just freezes it. The final shot of the film tells you everything you need to know. The tail, mid-bud, already producing humanoid copies. So I'm scoring Shin Godzilla a competition and predation rating of 9 out of 10. It loses the 1 point because, technically, denying it fuel is a viable predation strategy. Everything else, every claw, fang, tank, shell, missile, and torpedo, fails. And now we get to the part of the script that genuinely keeps me up at night. That final shot, the tail, mid-mitosis, the dozens of humanoid Shin Godzilla copies, frozen halfway through asexual budding. That is not a horror movie sting. That is, biologically speaking, a complete civilizational extinction trigger. Let me walk through why. Asexual reproduction by fragmentation or budding is one of the oldest reproductive strategies on Earth. We see it in cnidarians like Hydra vulgaris, which extrude polyps that detach as fully formed adult clones. We see it in some echinoderms, particularly Lynchia sea stars, which can regenerate an entire body from a single severed arm. We see it in planarians, where any cleaved piece larger than 279 cells can reform into a complete individual. And we see it in some plant rhizome systems, aspen forests like Pando in Utah, which are technically one organism reproducing clonally across 43 hectares for an estimated 14,000 years. A single tree the size of 80 football fields, older than written language. Now, imagine asexual reproduction with the radiation-fueled energy budget we just talked about. Imagine the genetic stability backed up by Deinococcus-level DNA repair keeping clones from drifting into non-viable forms. And imagine the developmental clock running at the mutation under stress speed we documented in the competition section. The math gets ugly very fast. If each of those tail-butted humanoid Shin Godzillas reaches the equivalent of Form 2 within 48 hours, and each in turn can begin budding its own copies after another 48 hours, you're looking at exponential growth that follows roughly the same curve as bacterial colony expansion. One parent, one bud per cycle, 2 organisms at hour 48, 4 at hour 96, 16 at hour 192, several thousand within a couple of weeks. Even with heavy losses to environmental constraints and human countermeasures, you'd be staring at a continental-scale colonization event inside a single month. For context, the most aggressive invasive species we have on record reproduce nowhere near this fast. Asian carp spawn hundreds of thousands of eggs per female annually. Most don't survive. Lionfish invaded the Caribbean from a handful of escaped aquarium specimens, and within a decade reached population densities of over 200 fish per hectare on some reefs. Crown of thorns starfish can produce 60 million eggs per female per spawning event, and have caused near total destruction of multiple Great Barrier Reef sections. None of these match the doubling speed of a fission-powered, regenerative, mutation-adaptive clone lineage. But, and here's where the biology pushes back, clonal reproduction has a real, well-documented Achilles heel: genetic load. When organisms reproduce asexually for too many generations, deleterious mutations accumulate. Lineages get stuck with whatever genome they inherited, plus errors. And over time, those errors compound. There's a name for this: Muller's ratchet, after the geneticist H.J. Muller, who described it in 1964. Asexual species can crash extinction fast if they don't have a way to purge bad mutations. Some real-world organisms work around this. Betyloid rotifers, tiny freshwater animals, have been reproducing asexually for an estimated 40 to 80 million years without crashing. They do it by horizontal gene transfer, absorbing fragments of DNA from their environment and integrating them into their genome. Shin Godzilla, with its radiation mutagenesis and stress-driven hypermutation, might pull off something similar, or it might collapse under its own genetic noise within a few hundred generations. So the population dynamics here cut both ways. Theoretically, Shin Godzilla's reproductive ceiling is apocalyptic. Practically, the longer the clonal lineage persists, the more likely the genome destabilizes. We could be looking at a horrifying initial bloom followed by a population crash within decades, or a slow, stable colonization that gradually outcompetes everything else. I'm scoring Shin Godzilla a reproductive success rating of 7 out of 10. Massive theoretical fecundity, real documentable biological mechanisms supporting the asexual mode. Genetic stability questions hold it back from a perfect score, but only barely. So let's add this up. Habitat Adaptability 6, Dietary Compatibility 8, Competition and Predation 9, Reproductive Success 7. A combined total of 30 out of 40. That is, frankly, terrifying. Shin Godzilla has no business being that biologically viable. Most fictional creatures I evaluate land somewhere in the high teens. Shin Godzilla pulls a 30 by anchoring almost every one of its impossible traits to a real Earth analog, and just scaling that analog up by 10,000%. The lesson here, I think, is uncomfortable. Fiction sometimes gets close to biology by accident. Anno and his consultants didn't design Shin Godzilla as a credible organism. They designed it as a metaphor for the 2011 Tohoku earthquake and the Fukushima Daiichi disaster. But the metaphor turned out to be backed by extremophile microbes that actually live in our oceans, regenerative animals that actually rebuild limbs, stress mutagenic bacteria that actually adapt to attack inside our hospitals every single day. The horror of Shin Godzilla isn't that it couldn't exist. The horror is how many of its parts already do. And as promised, stick around, because there are 3 plausible directions this creature could evolve in, given a few thousand more years of selection pressure on Earth. Scenario 1. The cooperative branch. In this future, Shin Godzilla descendants stabilize their genetic load through horizontal gene transfer. They find equilibrium with coastal human populations, and they gradually shift their fuel intake away from active waste sources toward ambient environmental radiation. Effectively, they become living nuclear cleanup organisms. Each individual settles into a stretch of contaminated coastline, Fukushima, Chernobyl exclusion zones, Lake Karachay watersheds, and slowly metabolizes the radioactive load over decades, sequestering it into deep tissue plaques that ultimately decay below background levels. I'd give this lineage the speculative binomial Atomocedus pacificus, the Pacific atomic whale. Calm, slow, almost reverential, the most useful organism Earth has ever known, and one of the only ways the planet survives the Anthropocene's worst legacy decisions. Scenario 2. The Specialist Branch. In this future, Shin Godzilla retreats. The terrestrial form is energetically expensive, vulnerable to human intervention, ecologically lonely. Selection pressure favors descendants that stay in the abyssal vent fields where the lineage originated. Over 1,000 generations, the body plan compresses. The limbs reduce. The dorsal radiator plates expand into thermoregulatory wings. The result, a deep ocean apex tied to thermal vent systems, partnering with and probably devouring the tubeworm and clam communities that already live there. I'd call this lineage Pyrolobus immensis, the great heat walker, in homage to the hottest living bacteria on record. We'd never see it. We'd never need to fight it. It would simply be there, 20 kilometers down, ruling its private radioactive kingdom forever. And Scenario 3. The Hyper-Predator Branch. This is the dark one. In this future, Shin Godzilla descendants take the asexual budding pathway to its logical extreme. Clonal lineages diversify into specialist morphs. Flying budded forms with membrane-supported gliding surfaces. Aquatic budded forms with finned propulsion. Even soil-burrowing budded forms that consume radioactive ores underground. Within 10,000 years, the lineage saturates every major biome on Earth, outcompeting native apex predators and reducing food webs to a Shin Godzilla monoculture. I'd give this terrifying genus the name Apocalypsaurus shinensis, the unveiling lizard of Shin. By the time anyone catalogs it, there is no one left to catalog it. Earth becomes, biologically, Planet Godzilla. 3 futures, 1 creature. And depending on which direction the genetic dice fall, this thing is either humanity's savior, humanity's quiet neighbor, or humanity's end. That's the math when you take a kaiju seriously. If this is the kind of decoding you want more of, hit subscribe, and drop a comment which scenario do you think is most plausible. Atomocedus pacificus, the gentle cleanup giant, Pyrolobus immensis, the unseen abyssal king, or Apocalypsaurus shinensis, the end of everything. Let me know which kaiju, cryptid, or game world creature you want decoded next. But here's what I want you to sit with before you close this video. We started with a question: could Shin Godzilla be real? And the honest answer, after 30 points out of 40, after extremophile bacteria and radiotrophic fungi and clone-budding starfish and stress mutagenic genomes, is not no. The honest answer is that Earth has already invented every single piece of Shin Godzilla, separately, quietly, in organisms most people will never hear about. The only reason this monster doesn't exist is that evolution hasn't bothered to put the pieces in the same body yet. somewhere 20 kilometers down. An event field nobody has mapped. The first piece may already be moving. Sleep on that.